On June 12th, 1806, a balding 38-year-old John Quincy Adams took the lectern in Harvard College's University Hall to begin a part-time job, moonlighting from being a United States Senator. At Harvard, he was the first person to occupy the Boylston Chair of Rhetoric and Oratory. And in that lecture, he spoke to a goggling class of very young freshmen, all men, of course. Now, this is a long and sordid tale. It involves one of history's greatest intellectual scandals. The protagonists, the bad guys, if you will, are all white men, along with possibly some lightly tanned men. But the story could have a happy ending, one in which all genders, races, nationalities, and ethnicities can benefit. And that happy ending will be largely up to you. Back to John Quincy Adams. He spoke in that Harvard classroom as a man of the world, preparing others to be men of the world. And he promised to teach them reason clothed with speech. His own style was not exactly naked. "Is there among you a youth whose bosom burns with the fires of honorable ambition?" he asked rhetorically. "Let him catch from the relics of ancient oratory those unresisted powers which mold the mind of man to the will of the speaker and yield the guidance of the nation to the dominion of the voice." I might urge the same thing of you, young men and women. Like many citizens of that young democracy, Adams believed that a talented individual could drive a nation's history. He'd seen his own father, John Adams, do it. As an 11-year-old, Adams, Feast, had spent a year in Paris with one of the most persuasive diplomats of the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin. He'd heard the speeches of the greatest modern orator to date, Edmund Burke. And now it was Adams's turn to teach persuasion as the paramount democratic skill. Commuting between Cambridge and the new capital city, a commute that took at least 5 days, by the way, he taught for 2 years, published his lectures, and went on to become the 6th president of the United States. And that was the last time rhetoric was taught at Harvard the way its ancient creators had intended. After him, the Boylston Chair went to a minister and later got handed down to professors who essentially taught creative writing. So why should you care? Well, I'll tell you why. Because rhetoric is the essential art of any republic. It's the tool our forebears used to invent democracy. Rhetoric was essential to the Enlightenment that birthed our own civilization as we know it. And I fervently believe that rhetoric, properly taught, can help save our democracy. So let me tell you a story about how rhetoric was swallowed up by the most prestigious school in the land, and how Harvard and the other elite schools might atone for their sins. In that first lecture, Adams admitted he wasn't much of a scholar. That wasn't so shameful. At the time, rhetoric was in rather an academic mess. Harvard was in thrall to a 16th century French scholar by the name of Petrus Ramus. This guy had almost single-handedly wrecked the 3 original liberal arts: rhetoric, grammar, and logic, the original trivium. While we'll focus on the rhetoric part in a bit, let me make a pitch for grammar. Back in the day, meaning 2 or 3 millennia ago, grammar wasn't just about speaking proper. It had to do with an ability to converse knowledgeably across boundaries, both geographic and chronological. It meant knowing the history of a culture and speaking to other elites in distant lands. Grammar comprised most of what we'd consider to be the humanities today. And upper-class boys were taught it before they learned anything else, hence grammar school. Now, Petrus Ramus was a Puritan, a fundamentalist Christian, who believed that the Word of God needed no persuasion, and that God's Word alone, not public debate or persuasion, should determine public decisions. So he departmentalized the 3 liberal arts, the trivium, and made sure that none of them was remotely useful outside of university campuses. You can blame that man for the modern connotation of the word trivial, useless, impractical. Ramus, by the way, was burned at the stake for his heresy. So get this. Harvard was founded by Puritans, specifically Romists, followers of Le Professeur Ramus, and those founders wrote into the college's statutes the requirement that rhetoric would be restricted to elocution and pronunciation. That requirement, by the way, has never been revised. So you might say that since I was invited by Harvard students to create this video, thanks Aristotle Vainikos, I am right now breaking the law. But then so was John Quincy Adams. He took an approach that was literally radical. He returned rhetoric to its classical roots of oral persuasion, and he defied the statutes and Puritan tradition by preaching the possibility that reasonable people can coax each other into public decisions. Now, Adams was not exactly an outsider when he arrived. He happened to be a distant relative of the chair's benefactor, the wealthy Boston merchant Nicholas Boylston. In the hope of fostering a well-trained political elite, Boylston had bequeathed 1,500 pounds to Harvard in 1771. But the economic chaos of the Revolution kept the endowment from producing enough income to pay for a whole professor. Harvard finally filled the chair in 1805 after a Boylston descendant threatened to sue to get his family's money back. The following spring, Adams began a course of Friday morning lectures supplemented with student declamations, speeches, in the afternoon. And so began both a revival of classical rhetoric and its almost immediate decay at Harvard. So how do I know this? Well, in 1810, Adams's lectures got published in 2 volumes. I discovered them by accident some 30 years ago, deep in the stacks of Dartmouth College's library. I was working at Dartmouth at the time, and honestly, I'd become a little bored in my job. I'd take ridiculously long lunch hours wandering the library's open stacks, pulling down books at random. And one day I found myself in a remote part of the stacks where the books were covered in cobwebs. The light was dim, many of the fluorescent bulbs had burned out, and I wondered what forgotten subject this was. I took down a book at eye level, opened it, and saw John Quincy Adams' signature. The pages were yellowing and they seemed to be mostly unread, except for one dog-eared lecture on eloquence of the pulpit. Someone had penciled into the margin, lecture too long. But then I squinted to read the first lecture, where I found the promise of the unresisted powers of rhetoric. It sounded like magic, right? And so I spent the next decades reading everything Adams told me to read, branching out into Renaissance rhetoric, the rhetoric of non-Western cultures, into modern rhetoric, into linguistics and neuroscience and behavioral economics and much more, meanwhile driving my family insane. I eventually quit my job and wrote a book because my wife begged me to. So, just what are these powers? Well, rhetoric teaches us to argue without anger. It offers a chance to tap into a source of social power that prior to meeting it through Senator Adams, I never knew existed. The ancients considered rhetoric the essential skill of leadership. It taught them how to speak and write persuasively, produce something to say on every occasion, and make people like them when they spoke. It trained Roman orators such as Julius Caesar and Marcus Tullius Cicero and gave the Bible, I believe, its finest language. It even inspired William Shakespeare. Every one of America's founders studied rhetoric, and they used its principles in writing the Constitution. Now, the art, as we know it, was founded by itinerant scholars some 3,000 years ago in ancient Greece, teachers who, in a nice bit of branding, called themselves sophists, the wise ones. Now, I'll focus mostly on Western classical rhetoric here, but the ancient Jews had schools of rhetoric that almost certainly influenced the Greek sophists who invented the art as we know it today. The ancient Chinese taught a version of rhetoric, and there's some evidence that rhetoric as a discipline was part of young people's education in ancient African and North American civilizations. In fact, it's hard to find a civilization through history that lacks the study of rhetoric. That is, until Harvard killed it. So how did the Greeks teach it? The most influential textbook on the art was written by Aristotle, the philosopher Aristotle, I mean. His book on rhetoric was probably the last he ever wrote, after he covered poetics, politics, ethics, and just about everything else. You could say that rhetoric was the culmination of everything Aristotle knew about humanity. So Aristotle listed 3 essential tools of persuasion: the logic of the argument, the emotions and attitudes that can be employed among the audience, and the persuader's own perceived character. In a perfect world, Aristotle wrote wistfully, cases should be fought on the strength of the facts alone. But he was the guy who invented logic, and late in life, he had to admit that logic was not the most persuasive tool. Instead, we're persuaded by whether we like and trust the speaker. Aristotle blamed this fact, which, by the way, has been confirmed by a great deal of modern research in the social sciences and neuroscience, on our sorry human nature. His words, not mine. I should tell you that Aristotle also defined types of rhetoric determined by what tense they entail. The rhetoric of the past is forensic rhetoric. It has to do with forensics, crime and punishment, whodunit, and what to do about the culprit. The present tense covers demonstrative rhetoric, which has to do with values, what's good and what's bad, along with who's good and who's bad. Present tense rhetoric is often called sermonic rhetoric because it tends to sermonize. It's also called tribal rhetoric for what should be obvious reasons. Aristotle's favorite rhetoric, deliberative, has to do with the future, about the choices we make as a group that affect the future. He said this was the language of politics. Now think of our current politics and what the tenses and topics tend to be. Lock her up! Those are bad people! Aristotle would not be pleased. So let me give you a real-life example of what Aristotle was talking about. It involves my son George when he was 15 years old. One winter morning, some years ago, I was in the bathroom getting ready to brush my teeth, and I discovered that the toothpaste tube had been squeezed dry. Being the father of a teenage son, I was pretty sure who the culprit was. "George!" I shout. "Who used up all the toothpaste?" And I hear a sarcastic voice on the other side of the door. "That's not the point, is it, Dad? The point is, how are we going to keep this from happening again?" Now, he had heard for years that the best way to get yourself out of trouble is to switch the tense to the future, taking it away from past tense forensic rhetoric and its topic of blame, and pivoting to future tense deliberative rhetoric, where together you can solve the problem for all time. I just hadn't known that George had actually been paying attention all those years, and honestly, I was kind of pleased about that. So I let him win. "Okay, George, you win. Now, will you please get me some toothpaste?" And he went down into our freezing basement, I live in New Hampshire, and he got me a tube. He was happy to beat his dad on points, and I got a teenager to run an errand, cheerfully. You don't get more consensual than that. So I had started out with a past tense, who used up all the toothpaste. What if I had used present tense, demonstrative, sermonic rhetoric? "George, a good son wouldn't be so thoughtless. How soon do you think I'd get toothpaste?" Now apply this to current politics and our ability to solve the problems we're facing today. Aristotle hoped that future tense, deliberative rhetoric would allow a people to weigh choices among each other and decide on the future without coercion or violence. Those choices, made through persuading audiences, would form a kind of temporary truth, a decision on the best choice to solve a particular problem of the moment, to navigate a certain contingency. Throughout history, there's been a debate on whether you should decide temporary truths like that, or whether you should follow the voice of God, or a human leader chosen by God, or by job creators, or the military, take your pick. So you had rhetoric's temporary, audience-decided, persuasion-driven truth, and you had absolute truth. What would Jesus do? What would the Bible say? What does our leader command? Then, during the 16th and 17th centuries, another player entered the picture, modern science. René Descartes thought it perfectly likely that human behavior would someday become fairly predictable. He might have invented social media if he had time. He declared, contingent truths, temporary decisions to be anathema. Descartes said flatly, "We reject all such merely probable knowledge and make it a rule to trust only what is completely known and incapable of being doubted." And so began the decay of the essential liberal art. We'll get to Harvard's role in a minute. Squeezed by Christian and science absolutists, the academic study of rhetoric turned increasingly to a bad habit, common to fields that are uncertain of their own worth, the proliferation of jargon. Most notorious among rhetorical terms are the figures of speech, combinations of words for emotional effect, and tropes, ways to pretend alternative realities. The Greeks came up with a few of them, the Romans many more. The terms are often useful in analyzing skillful language. You know about metaphor, maybe metonymy, alliteration, for example. Those are tropes and figures. But by the 17th century, the field was collapsing under their weight. There was the redundant epanalepsis. Year chases year, decay pursues decay. The run-on anadiplosis. For one of a nail, the shoe was lost. For one of a shoe, the rider is lost. Along with chiasmus, antisthekon, proparalepsis, epanaphora, paraclasis, paradiegesis, and a raft of other picnits and obesities. Grammar school children, including William Shakespeare, had to memorize as many as 200 figures. In Hamlet, Polonius abuses an antimetaboly. "'Tis true, 'tis pity, and pity 'tis true, a foolish figure, but farewell it, for I will use no art." Great Shakespeare. By Samuel Butler's time in the 18th century, the technical study of rhetoric was on the wane, but he still could charge in a famous couplet. "All the rhetorician's rules teach but the naming of his tools." No longer was formal argument a means for uncovering the truth in a public situation. It became an art of showing off, even of obfuscation. Scientists wanted nothing to do with it, and who could blame them? The English Royal Society adopted a resolution requiring members to use a close, naked, natural way of speaking. They meant this language to be in opposition to rhetoric. But plain speaking is not opposed to rhetoric. To the right audience, unadorned speech can be more persuasive, more effectively rhetorical than ornate speech. The most effective rhetoric disguises itself. Now, I did a study of political speeches over the past 50 years, comparing those of Democrats to Republicans. The Democrats used figures, elaborate language, far more than the Republicans. And what did the Republicans use? Tropes. The welfare mother, boots on the ground, synecdoche and metonymy. Complex, hard-to-spot tropes that turn our heads and change our view of reality. All the while sounding more plain-spoken and just the facts, ma'am, than the Democrats, who to this day try to sound like John F. Kennedy. "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country," which is a figure, a chiasmus, very fancy and sophisticated. John Quincy Adams fell solidly into the fancy and sophisticated side of rhetoric. But he also introduced me to the most useful tools of the art. I eventually wrote that book based in part on Adams's tools and came up with 110 of them. They're the tricks of a sorely needed trade. When he gave up the Boylston chair in 1809, Adams was replaced by a practitioner of a very different trade, a minister named Joseph McKean of Milton, Massachusetts. A member of the class of 1794, McKean had already achieved a certain prominence by founding Harvard's Porcellian Club and serving as class marshal. The McKean Gate on Massachusetts Avenue is named after him. He must have been a light-footed sermonizer. He rarely rewrote his addresses and was famous for speaking without notes at all. His theories are very different from Adams's. As a professional Christian, McKean emphasized not the ancients but Ramus and the ecclesiastical rhetoric of the Puritans. In his 9 years of teaching, before he died of tuberculosis at the age of 41, McKean swung rhetoric at Harvard away from the practical and back to the scholarly. The discipline never recovered. When the literary scholar Edward Channing assumed the Boylston Chair in 1819, oral address itself had begun to disappear. In his inaugural lecture, Channing asked, rhetorically, "How is it that eloquence has gone behindhand?" He helped answer the question by observing that the nation had turned to the written word for most of its public decision-making. "We have now many other and more quiet ways of forming and expressing public sentiment than public discussion in popular assemblies," said Channing. In fact, he argued that current society did not need rhetoric at all. The leaders who had helped forge American democracy and free it of British despotism had been replaced by institutions that now worked perfectly well without men of genius. The machinery of government was in place and required only moderately capable operators. We never need great men now to take the place of laws and institutions, but merely to stand by them and see that they are unobstructed and unimpaired. A great man is perpetually taught that the world can do without him. The students called Channing Potty. I don't know why. Potty Channing was no spellbinding orator himself. One of his students, Oliver Wendell Holmes, described his bland, superior look, cold as a moonbeam on a frozen brook. By 1829, Channing had handed off exercises in oral address to an assistant, Jonathan Barber, who made himself notorious by teaching exploding vowels and devising a bamboo sphere for use in practicing gestures. The sphere tortured students until it was hung from a barber pole in Harvard Yard. And yet, Potty Channing went on to become one of the most famously popular professors in Harvard history. During the 32 years that he held the Boylston Chair, he taught writing to Ralph Waldo Emerson, Charles Henry David Thoreau, and Edward Everett Hale, who wrote, "There are those who claim to be able to recognize from a 19th century Harvard man's writing whether he graduated before or after Channing retired." Although Channing expanded the bounds of rhetoric to include all communication by language, he stopped at the border of English literature. His successor, Francis James Child, was to have no such compunction. We'll call Child by the nickname students called him, Stubby. He was called that presumably because he was plump and short. Stubby Child was the model of a modern university researcher. He clearly disliked teaching, especially of classical rhetoric. "I feel only little interest in what is called declamation and would much rather be a teacher of dancing," he wrote in a letter to Harvard's president. As Harvard's new chair of rhetoric and oratory, he was like a fox in charge of henhouse studies. Child personally delivered rhetoric's coup de grace by founding Harvard's Department of English and seeking to banish the classics from it. The moment he became Boylston professor, he changed the title of the lectures to seniors from Rhetoric and Criticism to English Language and Literature. In 1876, the Harvard administration happily accepted reality and granted Child his own chair of English Literature. And so, Stubby Child killed off rhetoric at Harvard. His successor, Adams Sherman Hill, completed the job by destroying it at most other American colleges. His weapon, a book he wrote, highly influential, titled Principles of Rhetoric. Despite its name, the book did not mention oral address at all and completely avoided the classics. By rhetoric, Professor Hill really meant grammar. The famous Harvard historian Samuel Eliot Morison called him the high priest of correctness. Even more annoying, Hill had a high, reedy voice. Hill's textbook got widely used in the English departments that were beginning to spring up around the country, and Harvard being Harvard, it served as a model for other schools. Since classical rhetoric was dead in Cambridge, no self-respecting English department would think of keeping it alive elsewhere, except some of the colleges that sprang up after the Civil War to teach black students never got the memo, never got Professor Hill's deadly grammar book. Schools like Morehouse College and the Crozer Theological Seminary continued to teach actual rhetoric. Now, I mentioned those two schools in particular because of a well-known orator who studied rhetoric at both of them, Martin Luther King. And so, Harvard, which had to ignore its own charter just to teach rhetoric in the first place, abandoned it to historically black colleges, which to this day produce some of our finest orators, jurists, politicians, and leaders who will take us into the future. Meanwhile, Harvard did a pretty good job with the Boylston Professorship of Rhetoric and Oratory, teaching writing. The sixth person to hold the chair, LeBaron Russell Briggs, taught Conrad Aiken, Thomas Ibarra, Robert Benchley, E. Cummings, and John Dos Passos, among others, taught them writing, that is, not rhetoric. The seventh holder of the Boylston chair converted it into a chair for poetry, and so it's remained such ever since. Chair of poetry, not rhetoric. Subsequent holders of the chair have included Archibald MacLeish, whose most rhetorical act was writing the preamble to the United Nations Charter, Robert Stewart Fitzgerald, who translated Homer, and Seamus Heaney. The current holder is Jory Graham, a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. Not that I have anything against poetry. I hope you study it and study it well. I still recite poems I memorized in college. They let me chew on poetry the way a cow chews its cud. Very relaxing and nutritious, and you don't need earbuds. But imagine a civilization that no longer teaches poetry. Now try to explain poetry to someone who knows absolutely nothing about it. That's the position I find myself in when I talk about rhetoric, and why this virtual lecture is so darn long. Yet I barely scratched rhetoric's beautiful surface. Okay, you can legitimately ask why it matters that a chair endowed by a hopeful 18th century merchant to teach rhetoric and oratory is now dedicated to poetry. Isn't the country overfull of rhetoric as it is? True. But the study of rhetoric may be important for the very reason there is too much of it, too much undisciplined argument, and too few citizens who know how to listen critically. We complain about being manipulated by advertising and political campaigns and social media and Russia, even while we allow ourselves to be seduced. We decry the raucous nonsense of talk radio and QAnon, and then we put up with our own tribal nonsense. We yearn for real leaders, men and women who can seize the spirit of the nation and lead it to some place greater. Yet we distrust the very possibility of consensus. And that brings us back to Harvard. In the midst of an increasingly oracular society, one that communicates far more through speaking than through writing, Harvard requires that its students study expository writing. It has done so since 1872. But it doesn't offer a single course in which oratorical theory and practice are taught together. As the ancients understood, the two are inseparable. For a while, I had high hopes for Harvard. At one point, my book, Thank You for Arguing, was one of the top 10 books assigned to undergraduates. Yet just today, I looked into Harvard's course catalog to see if there is a single course offered in rhetoric. Nothing. Nada. Bupkis. Obviously, not every student is suited to the study, but maybe you are. Maybe you love language and you want to know how humans interact. While you're into knowledge for its own sake, you're also curious to see how knowledge applies in the marketplace. You want to learn how general concepts apply in specific situations, how theories become practice, whether ideals can become reality. You might end up in marketing, journalism, teaching, politics, the law, and other fields outside academia where language and thought get practiced professionally. Meanwhile, you're looking for something more than what you get in your courses, some outward direction for your studies. Rhetoric, the most outward-facing of all disciplines, may be just what you need. But I believe that's not enough. Without an education in argument, every student misses out on one of the greatest of intellectual skills. Our society is suffering from a lack of educated citizens who accept the uses of debate, who want to be persuaded, and who have the sophistication to avoid being manipulated. Our nation, our flawed system, was founded by deeply flawed people who believed that they were creating something that was self-correcting, a system whose flaws could be corrected by citizens who weigh choices together, who deliberate about the future. You should insist on rhetoric, not just for your sake, for the sake of all of us. My generation, I'm a boomer, okay, has screwed up this world to a fare thee well. It's up to your generation to fix civilization and restore us to the Enlightenment principles that gave us democracy and modern science. You need to insist on learning rhetoric. If you disagree, please argue. I've found it's the single best way to get knocked from my assumptions and learn something from people who are different from me, a privileged 65-year-old white man. So, thank you for arguing.
No, this isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.